Well, of course, the big black guy thinks his ticket is for up here. That's the first thing the gate agent said to him. She didn't know he was Alexander Sterling, the CEO of a billion-dollar tech firm. She didn't know his ticket was not only real, but paid for by a company that was about to sign a contract that could make or break her entire airline. And she certainly didn't know that with one single phone call, he wasn't just going to get his seat, he was going to get justice that would bring a global corporation to its knees. This isn't a story about a man getting revenge. It's about a titan of industry reminding the world what real power looks like. Stay tuned. The hum of New York's JFK International Airport was a familiar symphony to Alexander Sterling. It was the sound of ambition, of departures and arrivals, of a million stories intersecting for a fleeting moment before diverging across the globe. For Alexander, it was simply the overture to another deal, another city, another step in the relentless forward march of his company, Sterling Dynamics. At 42, he had built an empire from the ground up, a logistics and technology firm that was the silent, beating heart behind some of the world's largest retailers. He moved with a quiet confidence that was often mistaken for aloofness, a byproduct of being the only black man in 1,000 boardrooms, of having to be twice as good to get half the credit. He was dressed in his usual travel attire, a bespoke charcoal suit by a Savile Row tailor, no tie, and a crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. A Patek Philippe watch, a gift to himself for closing his first $100 million deal, was a subtle gleam on his wrist. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. His presence was his statement. Today he was flying to Chicago for the final signing of the largest partnership in his company's history. A multi-billion-dollar 10-year exclusive contract with the retail conglomerate Omnicorp. The airline Global Wings Air, GWA, was Omnicorp's preferred carrier, and this flight was meant to be a simple, comfortable prelude to a career-defining moment. He approached the bustling gate B42, where the priority boarding line for first class was a short, straggling queue. A woman with a tightly pinned blonde bun and a name tag that read, Brenda, stood guard at the podium, her expression a permanent mask of strained pleasantness. Alexander pulled out his phone, displaying the QR code for his first-class seat, 1A. As he stepped forward, Brenda's eyes flicked up from her screen, not to his phone, but to his face. They scanned him from his polished leather shoes to his neatly trimmed hair, and in that brief, dismissive glance, a calculation was made. A conclusion was reached. The professional smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of something colder, something deeply ingrained and ugly. She held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. Sir, the economy cabin seating will begin in about 20 minutes. Her voice was high and saccharine, the kind of tone used to placate a difficult child. Alexander held his ground, his expression unchanging. He was accustomed to these microaggressions, the small, sharp cuts of prejudice that were a daily reality. He simply extended his phone further. I believe I'm in the right line, he said, his voice a calm, deep baritone. Seat 1A. Brenda leaned over the counter, peering at his phone, not with the intent to verify, but with the intent to find fault. She squinted, her lips pursing into a thin line of disapproval. Then came the words, spoken just loud enough for the other passengers in the priority line. A hedge fund manager in a rumpled suit, a woman with a face tight from plastic surgery, to hear clearly. Well, of course, the big black guy thinks his ticket is for up here. The remark hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It wasn't a shout, it was a sneer wrapped in a customer service smile. The hedge fund manager shuffled his feet, suddenly fascinated by the scuff on his loafers. The woman behind him gave a quiet, conspiratorial smirk. The insult was designed to be deniable, a joke she could retreat from if challenged, but its intent was as sharp as a shard of glass. Alexander felt a familiar, hot flash of anger deep in his gut, an old rage he had learned to master decades ago. To show it was to lose. He had learned that lesson in boardrooms, in negotiations, on golf courses where he was the only person of color not carrying a bag. He met Brenda's gaze, his own eyes steady and unblinking. My ticket says first class, seat 1A, he repeated, his voice losing none of its calm authority. My name is Alexander Sterling. Please scan the pass. Brenda let out a small, condescending laugh. Sir, a lot of people think they have a first-class ticket. Sometimes there are mix-ups. She tapped a few keys on her terminal, her movements deliberately slow. I don't seem to have a Sterling in my first-class manifest. Are you sure you're at the right gate? Maybe even the right airline? The implication was clear. He was either too stupid to read his ticket, or he was trying to pull a fast one. He was a problem to be managed, not a customer to be served. I am quite certain, Alexander said, the calm beginning to feel like a lead weight in his chest. Perhaps you could try again. Sterling. I know how to spell, sir, she snapped, her professional veneer cracking completely. Look, I have a plane to board. The line for customer service is back in the main terminal. They can help you sort out your issue. She waved a dismissive hand toward the sprawling concourse behind him, effectively telling him to get out of her line and out of her sight. She turned to the hedge fund manager behind him. Next in line, please. Alexander did not move. He was a mountain in the stream of hurried passengers. This was no longer about a seat on an airplane. It was about the casual, systemic poison that Brenda represented. It was about the dozens of times he had been followed in high-end stores, the times valets had handed him the keys to other cars assuming he was the attendant, the times his credentials were surprisingly impressive to new business partners. He had absorbed it all, channeling the frustration into fuel for his ambition. But today, on the cusp of the biggest achievement of his professional life, he would not simply absorb it. He would not be moved. There is no issue with my ticket, Alexander stated, his voice now carrying a cold, hard edge that made the man behind him take an involuntary step back. The issue is with you, refusing to do your job. Scan my pass now, or get me your supervisor. Brenda's face flushed a blotchy red. She had expected him to shuffle away, embarrassed and defeated. She was not prepared for this quiet, immovable defiance. Security, she called out, her voice suddenly shrill with manufactured panic. I have a disruptive passenger. Two TSA agents, who had been observing from a distance, began to amble over, their expressions bored. This was just another Tuesday at JFK. But for Alexander Sterling, it was the beginning of a reckoning. He had built his empire on solving complex logistical problems, and he was about to treat Global Wings Air and its parent company Omnicorp as the most complex, most critical problem he had ever faced. The symphony of the airport was fading, replaced by the singular, focused beat of a battle he had no intention of losing. The arrival of the two TSA agents did little to change the dynamic, serving only to draw more unwanted attention. They were large men, their blue uniforms stretched taut over bulky frames, their demeanor a cocktail of boredom and procedural obligation. They flanked Alexander, not with overt aggression, but with the implicit threat of authority. What's the problem here? The taller agent, whose name tag read Rodriguez, asked, his gaze shifting between Alexander and Brenda. This man, Brenda began, her voice quivering with a performance of victimhood, is refusing to leave the priority boarding line. He's holding everyone up and claims to have a first-class ticket, but he's not on my manifest. He's becoming aggressive. The word aggressive was a classic trope, a loaded term thrown at black men to justify fear and prejudice. Alexander remained perfectly still, his hands relaxed at his sides. He looked at Rodriguez, then at his partner, a man named Chen. I have not been aggressive, he said, his tone measured and even. I have simply asked this agent to scan my boarding pass, which she refuses to do. When she failed to do that, I asked for her supervisor. Instead, she called you. Rodriguez sighed, the sound of a man weary of gateside dramas. Ma'am, did you scan his pass? Our system is having intermittent issues, Brenda lied smoothly, changing her story now that she was being questioned. I looked him up by name, and he's not on the list. I suggested he go to customer service to get it sorted out. My phone has the confirmation email from Global Wings Air, the receipt from American Express, and the digital boarding pass from your own app, Alexander said, addressing the agents directly. He unlocked his phone and with a few deft taps brought up the email. Flight 712 to Chicago O'Hare, seat 1A, paid in full, booked 6 weeks ago. There is no issue with the system. There is an issue with your agent. Agent Chen peered at the phone. Looks legit, he mumbled to his partner. Rodriguez pinched the bridge of his nose. Ma'am, just call your supervisor. Let's get this handled. Brenda, seeing her authority undermined, bristled. She jabbed a button on the phone at her station. I need a supervisor at gate B42. Priority boarding, a passenger dispute. She emphasized the last two words, trying to regain control of the narrative. While they waited, the line behind Alexander grew. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Phones were subtly raised, recording the scene. He was now a spectacle. The disruptive passenger, a 6'2" black man in a fine suit being detained at a gate. He could feel the weight of their stares, the quick judgments being formed. He was acutely aware of how this scene would look to a casual observer, how easily the narrative could be twisted against him. A few minutes later, a man in a slightly ill-fitting GWA manager's uniform bustled toward them. He was in his late 50s with a receding hairline and a harried expression. His name tag identified him as Robert Peterson, duty manager. He arrived not with a desire to de-escalate, but with the weary posture of someone swatting away another annoyance. What is going on here, Brenda? He asked, ignoring Alexander entirely. Mr. Peterson, thank you for coming, she said, her voice dropping into a tone of beleaguered professionalism. This gentleman is insisting he has a first-class ticket, but he's not on my manifest. I've told him our system is slow, and he's not showing up, but he's refusing to move and causing a scene. Peterson finally turned his attention to Alexander, his eyes doing the same dismissive sweep Brenda's had. It was a look Alexander knew well, the look that questioned his very presence in a space of privilege. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside, Peterson said, his tone final. You are holding up the boarding process for our valued first and business class passengers. The irony was so thick Alexander could have choked on it. I am one of your valued first-class passengers, he said, the ice in his voice hardening. I have shown your agent my ticket. I have shown the TSA agents my ticket. Now I am showing you. He held up his phone again. Seat 1A. All I am asking is for someone to do their job and scan the pass. Peterson barely glanced at the screen. He was operating on a different set of data. The word of his employee, his own ingrained biases, and the optics of the situation. He saw a flustered white female employee and a large defiant black man. In his mind, the case was closed. Sir, Brenda said you aren't on the manifest. The manifest is what we go by. Now, I'm not going to ask you again. Step out of the line, or we will have you removed from the gate area. On what grounds? Alexander challenged, his voice dangerously quiet. For possessing a valid, paid-for ticket and asking for it to be honored? On the grounds of interfering with airline operations? Peterson retorted, his face reddening. He was used to compliance. He gestured to the TSA agents. He needs to go. Rodriguez and Chen exchanged an uneasy look. This was escalating beyond a simple ticket dispute. Sir, Rodriguez said to Alexander, his tone shifting from bored to cautious. You should probably just go to the customer service desk. We don't want this to get out of hand. It was a warning, but Alexander Sterling hadn't built Sterling Dynamics by backing down. He had built it by pushing through obstacles, by being smarter, more prepared, and more resolute than anyone else in the room, or in this case, the gate area. It is already out of hand, Alexander said, his gaze fixed on Peterson. You are about to make a monumental mistake, Mr. Peterson. I am giving you one final opportunity to rectify it. Scan the pass. Let me board the flight that I have paid for. This was it, the final line drawn in the sand. He was offering them an exit, a chance to de-escalate and walk away with only their dignity bruised. For a moment, Peterson hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. He looked at Alexander's suit, his watch, the unwavering confidence in his eyes. Could he be wrong? Brenda, sensing his hesitation, stepped in. Mr. Peterson, he's threatening us now. I don't feel safe. That was all it took. The doubt vanished, replaced by a protective, foolish bravado. Peterson's face hardened into a mask of managerial resolve. That's it. We're done here. Agents, escort this man away from my gate. He turned his back on Alexander, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. Brenda, continue boarding. The TSA agents moved, placing their hands on Alexander's arms. The touch was firm, not yet forceful, but the message was clear. The humiliation was now complete. He was being physically removed, treated like a criminal in front of a crowd of strangers, all for the crime of being a black man who dared to own a first-class ticket. But as they began to lead him away, Alexander stopped resisting. A strange, unnerving calm settled over him. He had given them their chance. He had played by the rules of civility and reason, and they had met him with bigotry and bureaucratic stupidity. Now he would play by a different set of rules. His rules. "Fine," he said, his voice resonating through the suddenly quiet gate area. "You can have me removed, but I suggest you hold the plane." He shrugged off the agent's hands not with aggression, but with an air of finality. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. "You've left me no choice," Peterson scoffed. "Holding the plane? Who do you think you are?" Alexander didn't answer. He simply unlocked his phone, navigated to his contacts, and pressed a single name. He put the phone to his ear as it began to ring. Peterson and Brenda watched him with smug contempt, believing it to be a hollow bluff. They and everyone at Global Wings Air were about to learn exactly who Alexander Sterling was. The call was answered on the second ring. "Arthur," Alexander said into the phone, his voice as smooth as silk. "It's Alex Sterling. We have a problem with the GWA flight to Chicago, a problem you need to fix immediately." The name Arthur hung in the air at gate B42, meaningless to everyone except the man who had spoken it. To Brenda and Peterson, it was just a name, part of a pathetic last-ditch bluff. They exchanged a look of shared, smug victory. Peterson even let out a short, derisive chuckle. The TSA agents, Rodriguez and Chen, hesitated, their hands hovering near Alexander's arms, unsure if they should resume their escort. The watching passengers saw only the final act of a desperate man. On the other end of the line, however, the name Alex Sterling landed with the force of a thunderclap. Arthur Vance, chairman of the board for the Omnicorp conglomerate, was in his penthouse office overlooking Central Park, preparing for a celebratory dinner. Omnicorp wasn't just a retail giant, it was a sprawling empire of logistics, real estate, and transportation. And its wholly owned subsidiary, the jewel in its transport crown, was Global Wings Air. "Alex?" Arthur Vance's voice, usually a booming instrument of corporate power, was laced with genuine warmth and concern. "What's wrong? Are you all right? I thought you were in the air by now." "That's the problem, Arthur," Alexander said, his gaze sweeping over the scene in front of him. The condescending faces of the airline staff, the curious stares of the passengers. "I'm still at the gate at JFK. Your people at Global Wings Air are refusing me boarding." There was a moment of dead silence on the line. Arthur Vance was a man who processed billion-dollar transactions with icy calm, but the idea of the CEO of Sterling Dynamics, the man whose technology was about to revolutionize Omnicorp's entire supply chain in a deal worth north of $5 billion, being denied boarding on his own airline was so absurd, so profoundly incompetent, that it momentarily short-circuited his brain. "There what?" Vance finally managed, the warmth gone, replaced by a chilling quiet. "On what possible grounds?" "The grounds, it would seem, are that I don't belong in first class," Alexander said, the words precise and cold. "Your gate agent, a woman named Brenda, and her supervisor, a Mr. Robert Peterson, have concluded that my ticket is fraudulent. They have accused me of being aggressive and have had me removed from the boarding line by TSA." He let the words sink in. He didn't need to embellish or shout. The simple, unvarnished facts were damning enough. In his office, Arthur Vance felt a surge of fury so intense it made his vision swim. He wasn't a man given to moral outrage, but he was a zealot for competence and control. This was not just a customer service failure. This was a multi-billion-dollar catastrophe unfolding in real time, caused by the provincial ignorance of two low-level employees. The Sterling Dynamics deal was the cornerstone of his 5-year strategic plan. Alexander Sterling wasn't just a vendor, he was the key partner, the rainmaker, and his people were treating him like a vagrant. "Alex, stay right where you are. Do not move. Do not say another word to them," Vance commanded, his voice now a low growl. He was already swiveling in his chair, jabbing a button on his private console that connected him directly to the GWA Executive Command Center. "Who is the CEO of GWA this week? Get me Richard Davenport, now. I don't care if he's in surgery. Get him on the line." Back at the gate, Peterson was losing patience. "All right, show's over," he said, striding toward Alexander. "You've had your little phone call. Time to go." Alexander lowered his phone slightly from his ear. A faint, tinny voice could be heard from the earpiece. He looked Peterson dead in the eye. "That was Arthur Vance," he said simply. "Chairman of Omnicorp, your airline's parent company. He'd like you to hold the plane." Peterson froze. The name Omnicorp struck a chord of primal fear in any GWA employee. It was the mothership, the entity whose whims dictated their very existence. But the idea that this man had the chairman on his personal cell phone was still too fantastical to compute. "You're lying," Brenda blurted out, her face pale. Suddenly, Peterson's company-issued phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. He pulled it out, his hand trembling slightly as he saw the caller ID. It was a name he had only ever seen in company-wide emails. Richard Davenport, CEO of Global Wings Air. His blood ran cold. He had never received a call from the CEO. He had never known anyone who had. He answered with a shaky, "Mr. Peterson." He didn't get to say another word. A torrent of furious, panicked shouting erupted from the phone, a sound so loud and violent that even Alexander, standing several feet away, could hear the muffled rage. Peterson's face went from ruddy to ashen white. His eyes, wide with terror, darted from his phone to Alexander, a dawning, horrific understanding crashing over him. He started stammering, "Yes, sir. I understand, sir. He's right here, sir. Yes, immediately." Simultaneously, the phone at Brenda's podium let out a piercing shriek. She picked it up, her hand shaking. "Gate B42, she whispered. The voice on the other end was the airport's general manager, a man who had never spoken to a gate agent in his life. Her jaw went slack. Her carefully constructed world of petty authority was imploding. The change was instantaneous and total. Peterson ended his call, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked at Alexander as if he were seeing a ghost. "Mr. Sterling," he stammered, the name that he had refused to acknowledge just moments before now, tasting like ash in his mouth. "Sir, my deepest, most profound apologies. There has been a terrible, terrible misunderstanding." He turned on Brenda, his fear transmuting into desperate rage. "What did you do?" he hissed. "You checked the manifest? You scanned the pass?" Brenda was speechless, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. The TSA agents, Rodriguez and Chen, had backed away slowly, their faces models of sudden neutrality. They were no longer security. They were wallpaper. "Hold the aircraft!" Peterson yelled into his radio, his voice cracking. "Hold flight 7112 at the gate. Do not close that door." He then turned back to Alexander, his body language transforming into one of complete abject servitude. "Mr. Sterling, please, right this way. We will board you immediately. Please forgive us. Forgive me." Alexander remained impassive, holding his phone to his ear. "Arthur," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent gate area. "Yes, they seem to have located my ticket, but we're past that now, aren't we? This isn't about a seat anymore. This is about your corporate culture. We need to talk about the terms of our partnership. My flight can wait. In fact, I think your entire airline is about to wait." He clicked off the phone. He looked at the terrified faces of Peterson and Brenda, at the stunned faces of the passengers, at the GWA flight crew now peering out from the jet bridge door with confused expressions. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a threat. He had simply made a call. And in doing so, he had shut down the machine. Not just the gate, not just the flight. He had put the entire multi-billion-dollar engine of Global Wings Air on pause, and everyone was about to find out the price of restarting it. The atmosphere at Gate B42 had shifted from a public spectacle to something resembling the aftermath of a bomb blast. The noise was gone, replaced by a thick, anxious silence. The passengers in the boarding line stood frozen, their carry-ons suddenly feeling like anchors. They were no longer just watching a drama. They were inside it, trapped in the blast radius of a corporate detonation. The jet bridge door, which had been moments from closing, was now wide open. The flight captain himself, a silver-haired veteran named Harrison, emerged, his face a canvas of confusion and concern. He saw the tableau, a well-dressed black man standing with an aura of immense power, two terrified-looking gate agents, and a duty manager who looked like he was about to have a coronary. "What in God's name is going on, Robert?" Captain Harrison demanded, his voice accustomed to command. "My console is lighting up with a ground stop order from corporate HQ. They're telling me not to move under any circumstances. Is there a security threat?" Before Peterson could formulate a reply, a new figure burst onto the scene. This was a man who moved with a different kind of energy, not the harried shuffling of a duty manager, but the sleek, predatory speed of a senior executive. He was in his late 40s, dressed in a perfectly tailored Italian suit, his face flushed from a dead sprint through the terminal. This was Frank Giordano, GWA's Vice President of North American Operations. He had been yanked out of a board meeting by the CEO himself, with orders screamed so loud they were practically audible without a phone. Giordano ignored everyone, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on the only person standing still and calm. He beelined for Alexander Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," he said, slightly out of breath but forcing a tone of smooth composure. "Frank Giordano, VP of Operations. On behalf of the entire Global Wings Air executive team, and from our CEO, Richard Davenport, personally, I want to offer our most sincere and humble apologies for this inexcusable lapse in service." Alexander simply looked at him, his expression unreadable. He offered no words of forgiveness, no gesture of acknowledgement. His silence was more powerful than any tirade. It was a vacuum, and the frantic GWA executives were desperate to fill it. Giordano, sweating under the fluorescent lights, turned his glare on Peterson and Brenda. It was a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. He saw them not as employees, but as saboteurs who had just lit a match to the company's most important business deal. "You two," Giordano said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Get your things, your IDs. Your access is revoked as of this moment. Go to HR. Do not pass, go. Do not speak to anyone. An escort will meet you." He didn't need to say they were fired. He had just surgically removed them from the company's ecosystem in front of an audience. Brenda let out a small, choked sob. Her smugness had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, pathetic fear. The consequences of her casual racism were no longer abstract. They were brutally, publicly real. Peterson, his face slack with shock, simply nodded, a broken man. He fumbled with his ID lanyard, his hands shaking too much to unclip it. He had spent 30 years with the airline, working his way up to this meager position of authority. In 30 seconds, it was all gone. "Mr. Sterling," Giordano said, turning back, his composure returning now that he had excised the tumors. "We have your seat 1A, waiting for you. The entire first-class cabin is at your disposal. We will make sure you are comfortable. We can get you on your way to Chicago immediately." This was the moment they were all waiting for. The apology delivered, the offenders punished, the powerful man placated. They assumed he would now graciously accept his seat, and this nightmare would begin to recede. Alexander finally spoke. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "I am no longer interested in getting to Chicago immediately. My meeting there can be rescheduled. What I am interested in now is the phone call I just had with Arthur Vance." Giordano's blood pressure, which had just begun to stabilize, spiked again. "Arthur and I," Alexander continued, "were discussing the foundation of our new partnership, a partnership that relies on precision, reliability, and a certain standard of conduct, a standard which, it is now abundantly clear, Global Wings Air does not meet." He took a step closer to Giordano, forcing the high-powered executive to look him directly in the eye. "So no, I will not be boarding this flight. In fact, my company, Sterling Dynamics, will be grounding all corporate travel with your airline, effective immediately. That's approximately $300,000 a week in revenue, for starters." Every word was a hammer blow. The flight crew on the jet bridge looked at each other in horror. Grounding corporate travel from a major partner was a significant financial hit. "Furthermore," Alexander went on, "I will be recommending to Arthur Vance and the Omnicorp board that they reconsider the GWA contract as their exclusive carrier. Your airline's culture appears to be a significant liability to their brand. a brand we are about to become deeply integrated with. This was the kill shot. The Omnicorp contract was the lifeblood of GWA's domestic operations, worth hundreds of millions annually. Losing it would be catastrophic, leading to route closures and massive layoffs. Alexander wasn't just getting an apology, he was threatening the airline's very existence. "Mr. Sterling, Alex, please," Giordano pleaded, all pretense of corporate polish gone. He was now just a man begging for his career. This was the action of two ignorant employees. "It is not representative of our company. We will do anything, to make this right." Alexander looked past Giordano to the now empty podium where Brenda had stood. He looked at the passengers, who were beginning to grasp the sheer scale of what was happening. They had witnessed an act of racism, and now they were witnessing the kind of consequences that were usually the stuff of fantasy. "Anything?" Alexander repeated softly. "That's a very dangerous word, Mr. Giordano, because what I'm going to ask for won't be easy. It won't be a check or a free flight for life. It will be a fundamental top-to-bottom public reckoning, and it will start with a personal, public apology from your CEO, Richard Davenport. Not to me, but to everyone who looks like me and has ever been made to feel like they don't belong." He turned and began to walk away from the gate, his long strides eating up the concourse floor. He wasn't storming off in a huff. He was moving like a king, leaving a battlefield where the victory was already absolute. "I will be at my hotel," he called over his shoulder, not bothering to look back. "You have Arthur's number. Have your CEO call me when he's ready to discuss the preliminary terms of your airline's continued survival." Frank Giordano stood paralyzed, watching Alexander's retreating back. The plane to Chicago was still at the gate, engines silent. The passengers were still in line, going nowhere. The entire operation was frozen in time, held hostage not by a bomb threat or a mechanical failure, but by the will of one man who had decided that an apology wasn't enough. He wanted to see the empire tremble. The fallout from the JFK incident, or as it was quickly becoming known inside Omnicorp Tower, the Sterling affair, was swift and brutal. Before Alexander had even reached the exit of the terminal, news of the ground-stopped flight in the presence of a top executive at the gate had spread through the company grapevine like wildfire. By the time he checked back into his suite at the Four Seasons, his phone was vibrating with a call from an unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. A text immediately followed. "Mr. Sterling, this is Richard Davenport, CEO of Global Wings Air. I am at your disposal. Please, I implore you, call me at your earliest convenience." Alexander took a slow, deliberate shower. He changed out of the suit that now felt contaminated by the day's events and into a comfortable cashmere sweater and slacks. He poured himself a glass of Macallan 18, neat, and sat in an armchair overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. He was not angry anymore. The raw, hot emotion had cooled into something far more dangerous: strategic clarity. He had them. He had the leverage that advocates and activists dreamed of, a direct, causal link between a racist act and a catastrophic business consequence. He would not waste it. He finally dialed Richard Davenport's number. The GWA CEO answered before the first ring finished. "Mr. Sterling, thank you for calling me back. I have no words to express how horrified and ashamed I am of what happened today." Davenport's voice was strained, exhausted. "Save the platitudes, Richard," Alexander said, his tone devoid of warmth. "I'm not interested in your shame. I'm interested in your action plan. I told Mr. Giordano that I wanted a reckoning. Let's start defining the terms." For the next hour, Alexander laid out his preliminary demands. It was a masterclass in leveraging power. This wasn't about revenge. It was about systemic demolition and reconstruction. First, the public apology. It would not be a press release ghost-written by a PR firm. Richard Davenport was to hold a live press conference within 48 hours. He was to explicitly describe the incident, naming the airport and the flight. He was to call the actions of his employees what they were: racist. He was not to use weasel words like unconscious bias or inappropriate conduct. And he was to apologize not just to Alexander, but to the Black community for fostering a corporate culture where such an event was possible. Second, the firings of Brenda and Robert Peterson were just the beginning. Alexander demanded an immediate third-party audit of all discrimination complaints filed against GWA in the past 5 years. The audit would be conducted by a firm of Alexander's choosing, a renowned civil rights law firm, not a corporate-friendly consultancy. The results were to be made public. Any manager found to have dismissed legitimate complaints or fostered a discriminatory environment would be terminated. Third, and this was the masterstroke, Alexander demanded a complete overhaul of GWA's customer service, bias, and de-escalation training. And who would design and implement this new mandatory training program for every single one of GWA's 80,000 employees, from the baggage handlers to the CEO himself? A new diversity and inclusion consulting firm. A firm that Sterling Dynamics would establish as a nonprofit subsidiary funded by a mandatory, non-negotiable $50 million grant from Global Wings Air. The profits from this subsidiary would be funneled directly into scholarships and grants for Black students pursuing careers in aviation, logistics, and business. Davenport was silent on the other end of the line, the scale of the demands sinking in. This wasn't a settlement. This was a hostile takeover of his company's culture. The $50 million grant was a staggering sum, but the public audit and the forced implementation of a training program designed by Sterling's own entity was a complete surrender of corporate autonomy. That is unprecedented, Alex, Davenport finally whispered. What happened to me at your gate today was not unprecedented, Richard, Alexander countered, his voice like ice. It happens every single day in 1,000 different ways to people who don't have Arthur Vance on speed dial. The only thing unprecedented here is the consequence. These are my opening terms for even considering the continuation of the Omnicorp partnership. Take them to your board. Take them to Arthur. You have 24 hours to come back to me with a yes. There will be no negotiation on these points. He hung up the phone. The next 24 hours at Omnicorp and GWA were chaos. Emergency board meetings were held. Lawyers were screamed at. PR teams worked around the clock trying to contain the story, but it was already leaking. A passenger who had filmed the initial confrontation at the gate had sold the video to a news outlet, and the clip of Brenda saying, "Well, of course, the big black guy thinks his ticket is for up here," was going viral. The GWA brand was hemorrhaging credibility by the hour. Their stock price in pre-market trading was plummeting. Arthur Vance, seeing his legacy deal on the verge of collapse and his company at the center of a national firestorm, made the call. He didn't just support Alexander's terms, he championed them. He understood what the panicked GWA board did not. This was no longer about saving face. It was about saving the business. The cost of refusal, losing the Sterling Dynamics deal, losing the Omnicorp contract, and being branded a racist corporation in the 21st century was infinitely higher than the price of Alexander's demands. Richard Davenport called Alexander back in just under 20 hours. His voice was that of a defeated man. "We agree," he said, the words tasting like poison. "We agree to all of your terms." The press conference was a global media event. Richard Davenport stood at a podium, looking pale and humbled, and did exactly as he was told. He detailed the appalling and racist treatment of Alexander Sterling. He announced the immediate terminations and the sweeping independent audit of the company's human resources record. He then announced the mandatory $50 million grant to fund a new training initiative designed and overseen by a new nonprofit entity created by Sterling Dynamics. It was a corporate capitulation unlike any the business world had ever seen. Pundits on financial news networks were stunned. Activists were cautiously optimistic. And in boardrooms across the country, a new conversation was happening. The Sterling precedent, as it became known, was a terrifying new reality for companies that paid only lip service to diversity and inclusion. The risk of inaction suddenly had a very real, very high price tag. Alexander watched the press conference from his Chicago office, where he had flown the next day, on a private jet chartered by Omnicorp. The contract had been signed, but his victory felt different from his usual business triumphs. This wasn't just about a bigger bottom line. He had faced down a grubby, everyday ugliness and had used the vast, impersonal power of capital and commerce to force a moral outcome. He hadn't just gotten an apology. He had exacted a price. He had bought a pound of flesh not for revenge, but to build something new with it. The reckoning was complete, but the reconstruction was just beginning. 9 months later, the name Global Wings Air no longer evoked just images of airplanes, but of a seismic shift in corporate accountability. The aftershocks of the Sterling affair had permanently altered the company's foundations. The resignation of Richard Davenport had not been a quiet departure. It was a brutal, forced ejection. Arthur Vance had summoned him to the Omnicorp Tower for a meeting that lasted precisely 7 minutes. There were no negotiations. Vance had simply informed him that the board had lost all confidence in his leadership and that his security pass would be deactivated by the time he got back to the lobby. His replacement, Eleanor Vance, a formidable turnaround specialist with no relation to Arthur but a shared reputation for ruthless efficiency, was announced an hour later. Her mandate was simple: fix the culture or liquidate the assets. The third-party audit, led by the civil rights firm Alexander had chosen, was as thorough as it was damning. It was a digital archaeological dig into years of buried complaints. Investigators uncovered a pattern of what they termed discretionary discrimination, where gate agents and the staff in certain hubs routinely used vague clauses in the carriage contract to offload or deny boarding to passengers of color at a rate 3 times higher than white passengers. They found the file of the Miller family. A black family denied boarding on a flight to Atlanta for a funeral because their grieving, crying child was deemed a potential disturbance, while a white family with an equally distressed child on the same flight was boarded without issue. Their complaint, like hundreds of others, had been logged and dismissed with a generic apology and a $50 travel voucher. The release of the audit summary was a public shaming, and the subsequent firing of 17 managers and 3 vice presidents who had overseen these dismissals was a necessary, painful amputation. As for Brenda and Robert Peterson, their falls were as swift as they were absolute. Their names, leaked to the press in the initial furor, became synonymous with modern racism. Brenda lost her job and found herself unemployable in any customer-facing role. She ended up working in the stockroom of a discount retail store, a ghost in a place of commerce, her face occasionally recognized by a shopper who would stare with a mixture of pity and contempt. Peterson, stripped of his pension and forced into a graceless early retirement, sold his house and moved to a small town in Florida, his 30-year career reduced to a single infamous video clip. They were the public faces of the problem, but Alexander knew they were merely symptoms of the disease he was trying to cure. The cure was being administered daily through the Sterling Forward Initiative. Headed by the sharp and tireless Alana Shaw, the initiative's Ascend training was revolutionary. New GWA hires and grizzled veterans alike were required to spend a full day at a dedicated training center. The centerpiece was the VR module. One scenario, titled The Gate, put the employee in the digital shoes of a young, dark-skinned man in a hoodie holding a valid first-class ticket. As they approached the gate, the AI-controlled agent would begin asking probing, suspicious questions, her voice growing more condescending. The user's heart rate was monitored. As their stress level rose, the simulation would intensify. They felt the stares, the judgment, the rising sense of helplessness and anger. Another module, The Cabin, simulated being a flight attendant dealing with a passenger making racist remarks to another traveler. The program offered branching choices, demonstrating how de-escalation and firm anti-racist intervention could diffuse a situation, while ignoring it would allow the poison to spread. Initially, there was resistance. Veteran pilots scoffed at the touchy-feely tech, but Alana shared stories of hardened, cynical employees emerging from the VR headset in stunned silence. Some even moved to tears. "I never knew," one 25-year veteran flight attendant wrote in her feedback. "I thought I was fair. I never realized how many small things I did, how many assumptions I made, that could make someone feel the way I just felt in there. I will be better." On a crisp autumn afternoon, Alexander found himself back at JFK, standing near the gleaming, redesigned GWA check-in hall. He was there to meet David Chen, not the TSA agent, but a brilliant 19-year-old from the Bronx, one of the first recipients of the Sterling Forward Scholarship. The young man dreamed of designing the next generation of fuel-efficient jet engines. Alana met Alexander by a support column, holding 2 cups of coffee. "He's on his way. Got stuck in traffic," she said, her smile bright. "You know, that audit report is now required reading for every new MBA student at Harvard. You didn't just change an airline, Alex. You changed the curriculum." "How's the resistance?" he asked, taking a sip of coffee. "Fading," she admitted. "Eleanor Vance is a true believer. Not because she's a saint, but because she's a pragmatist. She saw the numbers. Post-ascend, customer satisfaction scores are up 12%. Incidents of air rage are down by a third. It turns out treating people with dignity is actually good for business. Who knew?" Just then, a young man hurried toward them, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "Mr. Sterling, Ms. Shaw, I am so sorry I'm late." It was David. He was bright-eyed and brimming with an energy that felt boundless. Alexander shook his hand firmly. "David, it's a pleasure. Don't worry about being late. In this business, you learn to build in buffers." They talked for nearly an hour. David spoke of his parents, immigrants who worked 2 jobs each, and of his dream of flight that began with building model airplanes on his bedroom floor. "This scholarship, it's not just the money, sir," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's the permission. It feels like someone saw me, you know? Like someone said, 'Yes, you belong in those rooms,' designing those things." Before, it just felt like a fantasy. Alexander saw the direct line from the ugliness at gate B42 to this moment of pure, unadulterated hope. He had taken the poison of that encounter and transmuted it into the antidote. He had used the brute force of capital not just to punish, but to create, to build a pathway for this brilliant kid who might otherwise have been overlooked. "The world will always have its Brendas and Petersons, David," Alexander said, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "They build walls. Your job, our job, is to build engines, powerful enough to fly over them. When you finish your degree, there's an internship waiting for you at Sterling Dynamics. The real work is just beginning." Looking at the hope in David's eyes, Alexander felt a sense of profound, complex satisfaction. This was his true victory. It wasn't the groveling apology from a CEO or the stock price tickers. It was this. It was ensuring that the next generation of leaders, creators, and innovators would not have to fight so hard just to be seen, to be believed, to be given their rightful seat at the table, or in first class. That's the incredible story of how Alexander Sterling didn't just fight for his seat, he fought to change the entire system. This wasn't just a moment of karma, it was a strategic masterclass in using power to enforce accountability. He proved that the most powerful response to injustice isn't always outrage, but calculated, world-changing action. This story shows that one person, when pushed too far, can leverage their influence to create ripples that reach far beyond a single airport gate, forcing a global corporation to confront its own reflection and pay the price for what it sees. What do you think about Alexander's methods? Was it justice? Was it a hostile takeover of a company's culture? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you or made you think, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. Thanks for watching.